When police found a body inside a house, they thought it was a home invasion gone wrong, until they watched the footage on his own phone. What they saw made seasoned detectives physically sick, and it led them straight to a killer who made one fatal mistake. He couldn't resist filming his revenge. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. It was the morning of December 21st, 2011, just 4 days before Christmas, and the streets of St. Petersburg, Florida were buzzing with last-minute chaos. Everywhere you looked, people were rushing. Arms full of gifts, grocery lists crumpled in back pockets, toddlers tugging at parents' coats, begging to see Father Christmas one last time. It was the kind of day that felt like it had a timer on it, like everyone knew the window for festive cheer was closing. But on that particular evening, while most people were winding down with holiday movies and hot chocolate, something else was unfolding. Something horrifying. A 911 dispatcher picked up a call. It was a man's voice, frantic, high-pitched and barely coherent. Quote, "Help, they want to kill me. Help me, please, help me, hurry up." The operator sat up straighter. This wasn't a prank call, this was real. Quote, "Sir, where are you?" There was a pause, then more shouting, quote, "Help, help." The operator asked, "What's the address?" And the man replied, "Landy Martinez." The name meant nothing to the operator at that moment. Was that the person's name? A street name? A clue? Quote, "What's the address? Please tell me the address." But the man didn't answer. All they heard was more panic and then a sudden shift in sound. A loud banging noise over and over. It was like someone was slamming a door, trying to break it down. The operator's voice got sharper. Quote, "Sir, hello, are you still there?" The reply, "Please help me, please." And then 2 loud popping noises. Gunshots. And then silence. The line stayed open for a few more seconds before finally cutting out, and the dispatcher didn't really know what to do. They didn't know who Landy Martinez was, they didn't know the address, but they did know one thing with certainty. Someone was in real danger. At first, the name Landy Martinez wasn't enough. The operator flagged the recording immediately, and the call was dispatched to local law enforcement, but with no location, officers had no way of knowing where to go, no scene to respond to. It was a call into the void, this man begging for help, and then silence. But that name, Landy Martinez, that wasn't going to stay anonymous for long. Landy's story starts in Cuba. He was born to loving parents who wanted more for their son than the island could offer. When he was still just a child, the family emigrated to South Florida, where Landy would live with his father and begin to build a life of his own. By all accounts, Landy was a bright, kind, deeply compassionate person, and it was that compassion that shaped his path. He moved north to St. Petersburg, Florida, where the air was salty, the people were open-minded, and the LGBTQI+ community was thriving. For Landy, who had come out as gay shortly after his 18th birthday, this was a fresh start, a place where he could be fully, unapologetically himself. He rented a room in a cosy little house by a couple he'd grown close to. They all got along like family, sharing meals, jokes, the kind of easy comfort that makes a place feel like home. And it was during that time that Landy found his true calling. Caregiving. He took a job at an assisted living facility in Tampa, helping elderly residents with everything from medication to mobility. And he seemed to love it. He didn't just do his job, he lived it. His co-workers admired him, the residents adored him, and he really had this way of making people feel seen, important, and safe. He had a close-knit group of friends. He had his family, who he still stayed in touch with constantly, and a budding social life in the heart of St. Petersburg's vibrant nightlife scene. By all outward appearances, Landy Martinez was thriving, which made what happened next all the more baffling and terrifying. Because while Landy was known for lifting others up, someone, somewhere, had just silenced him forever. When that 911 call cut out, when the silence hit, dispatchers were left wondering what they should do. They knew what they'd just heard. They knew this wasn't a prank or a false alarm. This was a man begging for his life. But here's the thing. Emergency response systems are built on location. When you call from a landline, your address is automatically linked to your phone number. That's because landlines are physically tied to a specific location. And I don't even know how many people still have landlines now. I haven't had one for years. But for any listeners who have only ever had a mobile phone, with a landline, the wires run from the phone directly into a network that knows exactly where that wire terminates. So dispatchers can immediately see your address pop up on their screens. But with mobile or cell phone calls, they aren't tied to a physical address. They're wireless, and they connect to the nearest cell towers, not to an exact location. So when someone calls 911 from a cell phone, emergency services don't automatically know where they are unless the caller tells them, or unless location tracking is used, which takes time. The average accuracy on this kind of call is around 500 metres. That's about 5 football fields, so it's a massive search radius, especially when you're in a time crunch. Eventually, authorities managed to narrow it down to 2 intersecting streets in St. Petersburg, but that still left dozens and dozens of homes to search. Multiple buildings, multiple driveways, back gardens, windows, and they still didn't know what they were walking into. For all they knew, they could pull up at someone's house, knock on, someone could answer, say that everything was fine, but inside, things could be devastating. They just didn't know. This didn't seem like the most efficient way, but it was the only way they had right now. So, officers began to canvass the area on foot, door by door, knocking, questioning, checking anything that looked even slightly out of place. They were desperate. Every minute that passed was a minute further from the gunshots, a minute further from saving a life, or catching a killer. Roughly 40 minutes after that frantic 911 call from Landy Martinez, after the gunshots, the silence, another call came in. This one was different. The voice on the other end was calm but concerned. It was a woman, and she told the operator that she was calling about her housemate. She said that he'd been staying at the house where they shared, and now something just felt off. Her housemate's name was Landy Martinez. Now, remember, this woman had no idea about the previous 911 call, no idea that Landy had begged for his life less than an hour earlier. She didn't know shots had been fired or that police were already frantically searching through that 500-metre radius, knocking on doors. But she did have something else no one else knew about, and that was security footage. And this is where things get a little bit eerie. In 2025, it's totally normal to have cameras around your house. Ring, Nest, Blink, all that stuff. But in 2011, that wasn't the norm. Ring didn't even exist yet. And while Simply Safe had launched, you've probably heard that advert on loads of podcasts, especially true crime. That company itself wasn't even a household name. People weren't wiring up their homes unless they were extremely cautious or if they had a specific reason. But this woman who called in, she had multiple cameras set up around the property, some inside, some out. And what she told the operator was chilling. She told them, quote, "The cameras have been turned off, all of them, and she hadn't done it. She was calling from a different location. Someone else was at the house. Landy was supposed to be there, but now the feeds from the cameras were dead. There was nothing, no signal, no explanation." Now, as she called this in, she wasn't necessarily panicked yet. She didn't know what had happened, but she was worried enough to ask for a welfare check. While the woman was still on the phone, dispatch sent a message to the officers who were still canvassing that large radius. They'd been moving door to door methodically, still unsure what they were even looking for. But now, finally, they had an address. The moment officers arrived at that small house on 16th Avenue, they knew this was the place and something was wrong. Before they even stepped inside, the first thing they noticed were the security cameras. Now, it's clear they had been positioned to show the outside of the front door, but as they looked up, they saw that all of the wires had been cut. When police knocked and got no answer, they didn't wait, they forced entry. The inside of the house was chaos. Furniture overturned, drawers pulled open, broken glass on the floor. This wasn't just a messy house. It had been ransacked with intent and violence, but it was the bathroom that looked like a scene from some kind of horror film. The sliding glass door of the shower had been completely ripped off of the tracks where it would usually slide. There was also a bottle of Drano liquid plumber, and it was open. The cap was nowhere to be seen, and there was a kitchen knife left on the sink. But nothing could prepare them for what they found next. Inside the bedroom, officers found Landy. He was dead. Lying motionless on the floor, Landy had been shot twice. Once in the chest and once, execution style, in the back of the head. Blood had pooled beneath him, but what really shocked the officers wasn't even the gunshots. It was the evidence of torture. The autopsy found numerous knife wounds, and they suggested Landy had been cut slowly. His wrists and ankles showed signs of adhesive damage from duct tape. He'd been tied up. And there was the Drano. Chemical burns were found on his throat and his eyes. Someone had poured liquid plumber, this corrosive, blistering agent, onto his face. The kind of injury that isn't meant to hurt, it's meant to be excruciating. To the officers, the message was clear. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong, this was personal. In fact, the signs of a robbery, like all the things in the house that made it look kind of ransacked, it soon became quite obvious that those parts had been staged. Nothing of value had been taken. And when I read about the acid, the Drano in particular, I did think that this sounded very much like a gang-motivated attack. It sort of reminded me, there was a case I did about a man called Brian. Gosh, this was many moons ago. It was one of the early episodes. I'll put the link in the show notes if you want to link out and listen to it. But it basically was a family man who was involved in drug dealing, and he was taken to a farm and basically tortured there in front of his children. And things that happened to him included chemical burns. It included like really horrific types of torture. And this was from a drug dealing gang. So it definitely reminded me of that kind of an attack. Anyway, the officers started piecing together what little they could. They knew something violent had happened before the fatal shots. There were signs of a prolonged struggle, like Landy had been fighting for his life, possibly for hours. The duct tape used to restrain him was collected and sent to forensics, and investigators got a partial fingerprint, but even when they put that into CODIS, they didn't get a match. Meanwhile, neighbours in the tightly knit street were questioned about if they'd seen anything suspicious. People here knew each other, and so it did stick out if there were strangers or things happening that were out of the ordinary. And on the night of the murder, 2 men, unknown, unfamiliar, had been seen nearby. As for the investigation itself, the house was sealed off and forensics swept every corner. And that is when one officer lifted the mattress. There, stuffed beneath it, half buried under a corner of the fitted sheet, was a mobile phone. It was powered off, and it was clear that someone had deliberately hidden it. And when police got a warrant to search it, what they uncovered was heartbreaking, because on that phone was a video, likely filmed just minutes before Landy was murdered. And it really is a horrific watch. You can find it online if you really want to, but I wouldn't recommend it. In the video, Landy is tied up with duct tape, just like investigators had found him, and he's pleading, speaking Spanish, panicky. You can hear the fear in his voice. And what struck me was that you can really feel the hopelessness. He almost seems deflated and utterly desperate. Obviously, the first thought was that police wanted to find out who was holding the camera. That was surely going to be the killer, but there weren't really any identifying moments or features that told them who was behind the camera because of the angle it was held at. But what the video did reveal was that someone had wanted to document Landy's suffering, not just torture him. but preserve it almost like a trophy. And it wasn't just the video that cracked this case open. Officers found more evidence on the phone. This time, it was text messages. Digital forensics pulled up a full record of the phone's most recent communications, and they could now roughly pin down the time of death, meaning they also knew which texts had been sent right before Landy was killed. Just minutes before he'd been killed, he'd been messaging someone named Jonathan Galacia. Investigators did some digging, and it didn't take long for them to find that Landy and Jonathan had only recently started dating. They were just a few weeks in, actually. They'd met on a dating app back in 2009, and they'd hit it off. But these messages showed that the relationship wasn't going the way Landy had hoped, because the final few text messages Landy ever sent were him breaking up with Jonathan. Not only was he ending things, but the messages gave great insight into why. In those final messages, Landy admitted that he still had feelings for his ex, someone he described as the love of his life, a man named Jose Adame. Investigators suddenly had a motive and therefore a potential suspect. Jonathan, a new boyfriend, dumped over text for an ex. Jealousy can make people do unthinkable things, especially when they feel rejected or replaced, and so they brought Jonathan in for questioning. But from the very first moment, Jonathan didn't act like a man with something to hide. In fact, he was visibly devastated. Obviously, we're used to seeing people pretend or act fake grief, whatever you want to call it, but in this case, the officers were fully drawn in. They obviously dealt with these kinds of things every single week, if not every day, but in this case, something just didn't sit right. Jonathan told detectives that the text messages he'd received from Landy's phone that morning didn't sound like Landy. Something about them felt off, like someone else was typing. And he said that the night before the murder, he and Landy had actually had a long, emotional conversation. One of those soul-bearing talks where everything is laid on the table. They'd talked about how much they meant to each other, about how this relationship could be something real. And I don't know if you've ever had that before, but when you start dating someone and you get that feeling that maybe this is your person, your soulmate. That's such an exciting time, and that conversation, if you've ever had it, is so memorable. And so Jonathan just didn't understand those text messages the next day. They didn't make any sense, especially with the timing. Still, police obviously weren't just going to take him at his word. But Jonathan did have something most suspects don't. An alibi. He'd been working a night shift and then he went straight home. He was alone that morning, but his phone records backed up his story. He'd been trying to call Landy, not avoid him. And when investigators pulled Jonathan's mobile data, location pings confirmed that he'd never left his home during the time of the murder. So just like that, he was cleared. The video, the texts, the fear, the desperation, none of it pointed to Jonathan. In fact, it raised another far more disturbing question. If those final texts weren't really sent by Landy, then who was using his phone after he died? And so, the investigating team moved towards investigating the other people in Landy's life. All of Landy's housemates, including the woman who made the 911 call, were ruled out. Their alibis were solid. They were devastated, cooperative, and were fully accounted for at the time of the murder. But that didn't mean they didn't have anything useful to offer. In fact, what they told officers next allowed them to hone in on their number one suspect. Remember those security cameras? The ones that struck investigators as odd because back in 2011, it was rare for a house to have a full surveillance setup. Well, those cameras were installed for a reason. The housemates had pooled their money to get them put in, not because of a general fear of crime in the area, but because they were scared of one man. Landy's ex-boyfriend, of course, Jose Adame. Jose had a reputation in the house. He'd shown signs of violence before, unstable behaviour, temper tantrums that sometimes crossed the line into threatening, enough to make people in the house feel unsafe, even when he wasn't around. And now that Landy had been tortured and murdered in the very same home, police were suddenly laser focused on Jose. They did manage to track Jose down, and that was when a picture that was much clearer emerged. He and Landy had once been deeply intertwined. They lived together, they loved each other, but things had ended badly. Jose had spiraled. He had not taken the breakup well at all. In fact, he'd been clinging to Landy ever since. Obsessive, controlling, jealous, all the markers of someone who could not let go and wouldn't let go. In the weeks leading up to the murder, Jose's behaviour was bizarre, even for a messy breakup. Investigators learned that the couple had shared a car whilst they were together. It was registered to Landy. Legally, it was his, but after the breakup, Jose kept that car and refused to give it back. And he didn't just keep the car, he weaponized it. He would intentionally run red lights. He would speed, he would rack up parking tickets. He knew that every single violation would be posted to Landy. It was petty and vindictive. His aim was just to get inside of Landy's head. It was attention seeking through destruction, anything to get a reaction. But Landy was very clearly done. All that tied him to Jose now was that car, and eventually, he came up with a plan. He knew that Jose still wanted to get back together with him, and so Landy played along, just long enough to get what was his. He told Jose they should meet, maybe talk things out, maybe try again. And Jose agreed, of course he did. And so they met in the car park of, I think it was a restaurant, it was a public place. But when Jose arrived, he would have seen that Landy wasn't alone. He'd brought a police officer with him, and that officer was aware of the situation and had reviewed the car's DMV registration. Legally, it belonged to Landy. There was no grey area here. The confrontation was calm, but final. The officer told Jose point blank, "You have no right to keep that car," and he basically made him give the keys to Landy. And look, Landy had really had enough by this point, and I don't blame him. He knew Jose had driven a really long way to get there, and now he was going to take the car, and he just left him there. Jose had done this to himself, and he'd have to clean up the mess. And for someone like Jose, his ego took a hit. His control was gone, and he'd been humiliated. This was, in every way, the end of their relationship. But what Landy didn't know was just days later, he would come across Jose again, and this time, it would lead to his death. A background check revealed exactly the kind of person they were dealing with. Jose had a criminal record, and not just for minor offences. He'd been previously convicted of home invasion and assault, violent crimes that suggested he was more than capable of what had happened to Landy. I remember reading that after I learnt about the fingerprint from the duct tape not being a match to anyone in CODIS. It might have been that Jose's details weren't yet in the system, dependent on when he got arrested. Or maybe even that the fingerprint was of someone else, which we'll get onto in a moment. Anyway, I wanted to mention it because that kind of pinged out for me. But either way, I couldn't find the definitive answer. It could be a number of things. Anyway, by the time Jose was brought in for questioning, police were ready for him. And Jose really didn't seem worried. He sat across from detectives, confident, almost smug, and denied everything. He claimed he hadn't seen Landy in ages, that he hadn't even been in the area when the murder happened. But detectives had already pulled his phone records, and using cell tower data, they could see exactly where he'd been. Jose's phone had pinged off towers in St. Petersburg, near Landy's house, at the very time they believed Landy was being tortured and killed. Just minutes later, the phone moved and then left the area. 14 hours later, it pinged again, this time hundreds of miles away at Jose's mother's house in North Carolina. When detectives laid this out, the bravado drained from Jose's face. He went pale and shifted in his seat, and then he started to retch. Seconds later, he threw up right there in the interview room. He hadn't been like this when officers told him that Landy had been killed or that he'd been murdered. He'd only had this kind of physical reaction when he'd been told his alibi was bullshit. And detectives had also spoken to those local witnesses. Multiple people in Landy's neighbourhood remembered seeing a man matching Jose's description on the day of the murder. And he wasn't alone. He was seen with a teenager. Both of them were in a black SUV. Detectives managed to track down that vehicle. It was actually registered to Jose's sister. And when investigators contacted her, she seemed confused. According to her, she had no idea that Jose had been using that car around the time of the murder. She hadn't given him permission and there was no real reason for him to have it. The SUV was sent to the lab for full forensic analysis. Crime scene technicians combed through every inch of the interior, and it wasn't long before they found two pieces of very important evidence. First, in the back of the vehicle, tucked into a side compartment, they discovered a partially used roll of silver duct tape. It was the exact same width, brand and colour as the tape found on Landy's wrists and ankles at the crime scene. It seems there was no way to exactly match this to the tape found on Landy's body. I remember a case where, I think it was on Forensic Files or maybe Cold Case Files, I remember they managed to match duct tape to a crime scene because of the tear or the rip. That tape on the victim matched the roll exactly, but in this case it really didn't seem like there was anything like that. The most they could do was match the type of duct tape. But on top of that, and far more telling, was a small smear of blood. They found it on the edge of one section of the vehicle, and at first glance it could have been anything. It could have been blood from a cut finger or a nosebleed, but of course they swabbed it, and when the results came back, it was a DNA match to Landy. The thing is, we know Landy had never been in that SUV. He had no connection to Joe's sister and no real reason to be anywhere near that car. So his blood being in it must have meant it was transferred from the killer. Jose had motive, he had opportunity, and he had a history of violence. And now there was forensic evidence tying him directly to the crime. But one question that the investigating team hadn't got an answer for yet was, who was the teenager seen with Jose? And what role had he played in Landy's brutal murder? Investigators believed the accomplice was someone they believed had helped orchestrate the break-in, the torture, possibly even the killing itself. That person was Jose's teenage nephew, allegedly. I say that because police were convinced he'd been there that day. Witness sightings of Jose with a younger male in the black SUV seemed to support that. And the fact Jose's phone and SUV lined up so precisely with the timeline of the murder, it all pointed to a two-person job. But unfortunately, circumstantial evidence only gets you so far in court. There just wasn't enough to charge the nephew, and without concrete proof tying him to the crime scene, no fingerprints, no DNA, no confession, he walked free. The case for Jose, however, was an entirely different story. He was charged with first-degree murder. Investigators pieced together exactly what happened that day. Jose had driven to the house in the early hours, likely with the help of his nephew. He disabled the home's security cameras, forced his way inside, and ambushed Landy whilst he was still inside the house, probably in bed given the time of day. Armed with a gun, Jose forced Landy into the bedroom, a confined, terrifying space. There he used duct tape to bind his wrists and ankles, leaving him defenceless. Then came the torture. The blood-streaked tiles, the broken shower glass, the chemical burns from Drano smeared across his eyes and throat, the knife wounds, all overwhelming violence. And more disturbingly, Jose, of course, filmed parts of it using Landy's own phone. That video became one of the most horrifying and telling pieces of evidence in the trial. In it, Landy is visibly terrified. He's duct-taped and he's pleading in Spanish. He's forced to say things like, it's not Jose's fault, and that the breakup was his own mistake. He blames himself, but anyone watching the footage could see it clearly. This wasn't a confession, this was coercion. A man forced at gunpoint to say whatever his abuser wanted to hear. It was Jose's ego, ironically, that helped seal the case against him. His need to hear Landy admit that he was wrong, his desire to be seen as the victim. Jose was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the first-degree murder of Landy Martinez. The prosecutor told the court that this case was one of the most viciously premeditated acts he'd ever worked on. The judge commented on the brutality and calculated nature of the killing, noting that Jose had every opportunity to walk away, but he chose not to, ending the life of someone he had once claimed to love.